Good evening and welcome to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. My name is David Brigham and I'm the librarian and CEO here. Tonight's event is the product of a fruitful partnership between HSP and Taller Puertorriqueño. As part of HSP's 5-year strategic plan, which we began implementing in 2022, we are concentrating our collecting, programming, partnering, and marketing efforts around 5 key themes. This is our 4th of 5 partnership projects and highlights our core theme, America's Promise and Its Many Voices. As HSP celebrates its 200th anniversary, we are thrilled that Taller is marking its 50th anniversary, making this an ideal moment for collaboration. This project revives our relationship that previously entailed the Audience Embedded project, resulting in Vecinos, a bilingual website that employs essays, oral histories, videos, and artwork to answer the question, what is a neighborhood? To highlight the importance of communities, history, and neighborhoods, HSP is also hosting a block party on October 5th, and look for these flyers downstairs, which will give you details. It's free. We'll be right here on the 1300 block of Locust, and we'll have over 20 cultural organizations with us that day, as well as food trucks and special highlights from the collection on view inside this building. Tonight's keynote address by nationally renowned award-winning journalist Juan González is also an essential part of our partnership with Taller in celebration of the rich diversity that makes our nation strong. I'd like to thank my staff and acknowledge them from the Learning and Engagement Department, Justina Barrett, who heads up that department, and Selena Bemak, who was the coordinator for this project, and Katie Clark, who are all here and making this work happen. It's now my pleasure to welcome to the podium my colleague Erica Goslin, Taller's Deputy and Interim Executive Director. And after the program, we invite you to come back downstairs to see the exhibit and enjoy the good company of our speaker, our friends, and our colleagues. So Erica, please.
Thanks, David. Good evening. My name is Erica Goslin, and I'm the Deputy Director and Interim Executive Director at Taller Puertorriqueño. I want to acknowledge and thank my African, Taino, and Euro ancestors who are here with me in this room. I'm thrilled to be here at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania for this wonderful collaboration that celebrates the collective 250 years of history here in Philadelphia. Thank you to our staff at Taller Puertorriqueño for your tireless, dedicated work. And thank you to our board members, current and former, many of whom are here tonight. Some of you have known Taller for quite some time, but for those of you who don't, I invite you to come check us out. Consider supporting us through membership and coming to some of our programs. In the midst of commemorating Taller Puertorriqueño's 50th anniversary year, I'm so proud of the work we continue to do through our community archives, our arts education after-school programs, our exhibitions program, and our bilingual bookstore, all focused on telling our stories from within. I was first introduced to our speaker tonight, Juan Gonzalez, when my mom would play Democracy Now! In our family room, often talking back to the TV in conversation. It became a kind of backdrop in my household. And I've come to understand that Juan Gonzalez has also been known to Taller in different ways for many years. So I feel honored to be able to introduce him tonight. Juan Gonzalez is an award-winning journalist and investigative reporter who spent 29 years as a columnist for the New York Daily News and 10 years with the Philadelphia Daily News. He's a 2-time George Polk Award winner and co-host of Democracy Now! Since 1996. An accomplished author, his works include Harvest of Empire and News for All the People. Gonzalez also served as the Richard D. Heffner Professor at Rutgers University and is a founder of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Before journalism, he was a civil rights activist, co-founding the Young Lords Party in the late 1960s. Born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, he grew up in New York City. I'm pleased to welcome Juan Gonzalez.
Thank you and good evening to everyone. Let me just get set here. It's great to see so many old friends here. My thanks to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania and my congratulations to Taller Puertorriqueño for their 50th anniversary and for the tremendous exhibition they've mounted, one that begins to make visible to the general public some highlights of the immense contributions that Puerto Ricans have made to the life of this great city and to the entire Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Thanks as well to Justina Barrett for inviting me to share some thoughts on the broader context of Puerto Rican life in the United States and on how and why so many people from that small Caribbean island ended up here. And especially for inviting me back to Philadelphia, a city which I've always considered my second home, for which I still retain some of my fondest memories of comradeship, community building, cultural pride, and familia. The place where I raised 2 daughters and where I established friendships that have endured for decades. Because of that, my remarks will necessarily involve some personal recollections, not merely as a journalist and historian, but as a longtime community activist who didn't simply chronicle the subject, but lived it. Thus, the title of my talk, From Puerto Rico to Pennsylvania, History, Challenges, and Amor, Boricua. My family was part of that mass working class migration from the island to the United States after World War II. My father and his 2 brothers all served in that war in Puerto Rico's own Borinqueniers, the famous 65th Infantry. My father actually enlisted in the military at the age of 16, lying about his age to get in. A regiment of colonial soldiers from the island who spoke no English when they joined the US military, but somehow ended up attached to General Patton's 7th Army that drove across North Africa, up the boot of Italy, and into Germany. After the war, all the brothers, unable to find work back home, decided to migrate to New York City. And all of them initially ended up with jobs as kitchen workers in the legendary Copacabana in Manhattan. So as was mentioned, though I was born in Puerto Rico in 1947, I was raised in New York City's East Harlem and in public housing in Brooklyn, and have spent virtually all my 76 years in this country. For about 15 of those years, from the early 1970s to the late 1980s, I resided right here in Philadelphia, where I was deeply involved in the life of the Puerto Rican community and where I spent about a decade as a reporter for the old Philadelphia Daily News before being lured back home to New York to continue my career as a staff columnist for the Daily News for several decades. And as was mentioned, where I began in 1996 to co-host the radio and TV show Democracy Now! So it's almost 29 years that we've been on the air with Democracy Now! In 2016, I left the Daily News and went to teach journalism at Rutgers as the Richard D. Heffner Professor of Communications, and until last year when I made yet another move to Chicago and accepted a post as Senior Fellow at the Great Cities Institute at the University of Illinois, Chicago. So I've been lucky to have lived in and been part of the 3 largest urban Puerto Rican populations in the United States: New York City, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Puerto Ricans, of course, have been the nation's 2nd largest community for decades. And of course, the Latino population of the United States keeps expanding. They're about now 63.5 million, 19% of the population. If you add the 3.2 million in Puerto Rico, it's actually about 60, almost 67. And if you add the 3 million that the Census Bureau itself admits was undercounted in the 2020 census, we're looking close to 70 million people of Latino origin living in the United States right now. Of course, the Mexican population is the largest, followed by Puerto Ricans, again, 5.9 million here, and another 3 million on the island, because not all the 3.2 million on the island are Puerto Ricans, but most of them are. Followed by Salvadorans, who have now passed Cubans as the third largest Latino group in the United States, and then the Cubans, Dominicans, Guatemalans, Colombians, Hondurans, and the rest. So really, the Latino population of the United States is predominantly Mexican, significantly Puerto Rican, and then of all the other groups. But the real story of Puerto Ricans today is not in their concentration, but in their dispersal throughout the US. New York's Puerto Rican population has plummeted. It was about 900,000 back in 1970. It went down to 715,000 in 2017. Then it had a bigger drop during the pandemic, so that now there are only 574,000 Puerto Ricans left in New York City. And Chicago's Puerto Rican population has declined dramatically. It was over about 130,000 decades ago. It's now down to about 62,000. So Philadelphia actually has now the second largest Puerto Rican population in the United States after New York City of the urban areas. So it has grown in its size, comparatively speaking. But the reality is that the dispersal of the Puerto Rican community is what's really happened. Because even though, for instance, Chicago's Puerto Rican population has declined, the population in Illinois has grown. And as you all know, that there's been a slight decrease in the Puerto Rican population of Philly, but it's the dispersal to the other towns that is the key. What is happening is the suburbanization of the Latino community and especially the Puerto Rican community. What about the rest of Pennsylvania? There's 33,000 Puerto Ricans in Allentown, and Latinos are 54% of the residents. There's 29,000 in Reading, and Latinos are 67% of the residents of Reading. Another 15,000 Puerto Ricans in Lancaster, and Latinos are 40% of the town. And Bethlehem, the Latinos are 30% of the town, but there's 14,000 Puerto Ricans. So the people have been driven out by gentrification, the high cost of living, and by, as the populations age, a desire to get more space and to get away from crime. So the real story of Puerto Ricans and other Latinos in the United States today is their increasing suburbanization. There are a dozen suburban towns around Chicago that have more than 50% Latino population. And yet Cicero, Illinois, the infamous Cicero, Illinois, is 86% Latino today, right? And Waukegan is 70% Latino. And so this is what's happening. Of course, the political representation has not followed the same line. So the real story of empowerment for the Latino and the Puerto Rican community in the future is in these suburban towns, is in the school boards and in the city councils and the mayoralties of these towns in the future. So, of course, the biggest growth area for the Puerto Rican population is not New York. It's not Philadelphia, it's not Chicago, it's Central Florida, right? Central Florida, the Orlando, Kissimmee metropolitan region. Florida is now the center, really, of the Puerto Rican community in the United States. So there's been an enormous shift in the population. So how did this migration to this city begin? A handful of excellent historians have documented the Philadelphia experience during those early years far better than I could. I'm thinking of the amazing work done by Carmen Whalen, my old friend of decades, Victor Vasquez, Edwin Maldonado, and Alyssa Rivero over at Allegheny College, some of which I'll mention in a moment. All point to the long-running issue of the colonial status of Puerto Rico as a key factor in causing these initial migrations. But after more than 125 years as a US territory, it's not enough just to point to the colonialism in Puerto Rico. Far more important is to unravel how the mechanism of colonial control has evolved and why it has managed to survive for so long. In that regard, I've divided it into three distinct phases or guises. And this is my own sort of like sketch of what has happened to the Puerto Rican colony over all these years. First was the classic colonial phase, which dealt basically from the Spanish-American War of 1898 to the creation of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in 1952. The main characteristics of this phase of colonialism was one, direct control of island affairs by American governors who were appointed in Washington. Right? They ran the island, but they were Americans appointed by Washington. By resource extraction by the U.S. Sugar Trust and the destruction of the island's own domestic coffee and tobacco industries. By the stamping out of the Spanish language and of Puerto Rican culture, a systematic attempt to make Puerto Ricans speak English, to turn the schools into English-speaking schools, and to deny even the existence of a Puerto Rican culture. By the massive repression of anyone who opposed this, the independence movements of various stripes, all massively repressed, and by a Supreme Court that justified all of this through a series of cases known as the Insular decisions in the early 1900s that essentially stated that the United States had a right to hold colonial territories, that Puerto Rico, like the Philippines, were unincorporated territories that belonged to but were not part of the United States. Unlike the other territories, Arizona, Oklahoma, others that were incorporated territories that would eventually become states. So this was the contours of that first period of colonialism, the sort of what you'd call classic colony. Isolated examples of extracting the island's workers began almost immediately after the Spanish-American War, not extracting the sugarcane, extracting the people. 5,000 Puerto Ricans contracted in the early 1900s by the Hawaii Sugar Growers Association to cut cane in Hawaii, shipped by ship to New Orleans, by train to California, by ship to Hawaii. 1912, the Arizona Cotton Growers Association contracts several hundred Puerto Ricans to go pick cotton in Arizona. Both of those had miserable results because the workers rebelled. They resisted their oppression. And so it really wasn't until several years later, as Victor Vasquez noted, in the early teens and 20s, that Puerto Rican cigar workers, along with Cubans, began arriving in Philadelphia, which was a center of the cigar industry at the time. Now remember, the United States had destroyed the tobacco industry in Puerto Rico, so there were many tobacco workers that were no longer employed. Apparently, some of them ended up right here in Philadelphia, in Southwark. And there were several Cuban-owned cigar operations here in Philadelphia that employed a lot of Puerto Rican workers. By 1904, the small Latino enclave in Philadelphia, Southwark, was home to approximately 1,500 Puerto Ricans, a number that will continue to grow. And this is a Bayoc Brothers cigar company, was one of the big companies. They eventually moved, they were at 10th and Bainbridge, and they employed Puerto Ricans and Cubans, but there were another dozen or so companies that operated here. But the Great Migration came after the Second World War in the late 1940s and 1950s, as U.S. industry also sought to bring African-American workers from the South, workers from Mexico through the Bracero program, and from Puerto Rico. That was the period of what I call the second phase of colonialism. And that was the phase of the industrialized autonomous colony. Because of all that resistance in Puerto Rico, the powers that be, both in Puerto Rico and the United States, decided that there had to be some sort of autonomy granted to the Puerto Rican people. And of course, right after the war, the creation of the United Nations and the move to decolonize the world as the French and the British and all the other colonial powers started giving up their colonies. The United States was under a lot of pressure to stop the classic colony that existed in Puerto Rico. So it devised a new idea that there would be limited self-government. That would be a form of self-determination, but sovereignty would still remain within the US government. This was also the period that marked the creation of cheap offshore manufacturing centers through Operation Bootstrap and turning Puerto Rico into a tax haven for corporations. The planned massive migration of unskilled workers to the United States. As I mentioned, the limited self-government known as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. The return of Spanish as a primary language. I know many independentistas love to rail against Muñoz Marín, the architect of this. But one of the good things that Muñoz Marín did was that he brought back Spanish as a language of the schools. He brought back a new effort to raise up the culture and the heritage of Puerto Rico. And to some degree, that helped maintain the national consciousness of the Puerto Rican people, even through this period of still colonialism, but now it was an industrialized colony because it was mostly workers, and it was an autonomous colony. And also another big factor here was subsequent to World War II, the creation of all these military bases across Puerto Rico. Fort Buchanan, Roosevelt Roads, Ramey Air Force Base. There were all these bases that were created by the military in Puerto Rico as part of the Cold War. So this was the second major phase of colonialism in Puerto Rico. The labor recruitment began in earnest after the war. As Maldonado notes, on May 9th, 1944, 858 workers arrived here on the East Coast from contracted workers from Puerto Rico. They were distributed as follows. 758 of them were assigned to the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. 100 of them were assigned to the Edgar F. Herf Company of Swedesboro, New Jersey. And Herf was then one of the largest privately owned seed processing and vegetable packing plants in the world. On June 4th, 1 month later, 680 Puerto Ricans were distributed between the B&O Railroad, 280 of them went to the B&O Railroad, 200 to the Campbell Soup Company in Camden, and 200 to the Utah Copper Company of Bingham, Utah. I wonder whatever happened to those Puerto Ricans. The final boatload in July of another 600, they were split up. There were 615. 300 of them went to Campbell Soup, and 315 went to Herf, to the ketchup maker, in Swedesboro. Carmen Whalen notes in her research that from May to August of 1946, 900 workers were recruited by the Samuel Friedman Agency to work in the farms of South Glassboro and Eastern Pennsylvania. Now, Samuel Friedman Company is very interesting. It's a labor agency, has a checkered history in Puerto Rico. Samuel Friedman's father was a soldier in the Spanish-American War. He settled in Puerto Rico for a while. Then his son created a labor contracting company to supply Puerto Rican workers to all of these American companies across the United States. Lorain, Ohio, Youngstown Tube and Sheet, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, other places. In May of 1947, the Philadelphia YWCA's Metropolitan Industrial Committee did a report exposing the conditions of 22 Puerto Rican women who'd been recruited as domestic workers, but who were being here to Philadelphia, but who were being treated virtually as slaves with no time off. And so the YWCA raised a ruckus about the treatment of the Puerto Rican women. So it's critical to understand that Puerto Ricans came to this area and to across the United States largely as low-wage contracted labor for industry and agriculture. But many rebelled. against their treatment, left their employers, and a significant number ended up gravitating to the big cities, right? And the main big city in this area was Philadelphia. By the time I arrived in the city in May of 1973, the Puerto Rican community was well established, but virtually invisible to the rest of the city. I moved here as a member of the Young Lords, who some of you may be familiar with. The Lords were a loud, brash, rebellious, and immensely talented group who sought to defend the Puerto Rican migrant community from systemic discrimination and to end our homeland's colonial status. For a few brief years, we became a thorn in the side of the establishment and law enforcement in New York City, Philadelphia, Newark, Trenton, Boston, Bridgeport, and Detroit, with our many occupations of institutions and militant actions against police misconduct. And in the process, we inspired a generation of young Latinos to demand more equitable treatment. Here's a picture of us in the People's Church that we occupied in 1970. I'm the one in the beret over there. We focused not only on the concrete bread and butter issues of more traditional community organizers, better schools, better health care, better city services, but on studying and learning our history, on building solidarity with other racial groups. In fact, the original Rainbow Coalition concept that Reverend Jesse Jackson later popularized was pioneered as an alliance of the Chicago Black Panther Party, the Young Lords, and the Young Patriots, an Appalachian white radical group. We were also openly socialist and internationalists, refusing to fight in the Vietnam War, inspired by the Cuban Revolution, seeking solidarity with the liberation wars in Africa and Latin America against Western imperialism. We not only created our own bilingual newspaper, Palante, and here's an issue back then of Palante, that's our leadership. I'm the one sitting down in the middle. Our own weekly radio show, WBAI, on WBAI, we consciously sought to shape how the commercial media covered our actions and ideas. As a result, we emerged as one of the few 1960s revolutionary groups that received considerable sympathetic coverage in the mainstream media. That was no accident. It had everything to do with understanding storytelling. Our Minister of Information, Pablo Yoruba Guzman, who was only 19 at the time, had studied as a high school student one of the visionary media scholars of that era, the Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan, and had quickly digested the essence of McLuhan's remarkable critique, that every medium acts on us, not primarily through the words or images it conveys, but through the way it connects to our brain and triggers our emotions. Pablo then consciously worked to shape a distinct Young Lords message for each medium of the press, radio, TV, newspapers. McLuhan, of course, famously proclaimed that media are extensions of human beings, that the content of a medium, he once wrote, is like the juicy piece of meat carried by the burglar to distract the watchdog of the mind. This obscure Canadian philosopher, of course, was writing long before the creation of the internet, the World Wide Web, and the smartphone, advances that only further confirmed his theories. Think about it. What is more important today, the actual content of any message or video we receive on our smartphones, or the fact that the device itself has become the indispensable instrument of modern society, tying us to the outside world, and through it, not only are we in constant contact with our family, friends, employers, and even total strangers, but unseen forces are constantly tracking us, surveilling our thoughts and wants, our every search, our every action, everywhere we go. Even as youngsters, we in the Lords understood the importance of controlling our own narrative, of inspiring ordinary people to action through powerful stories, bold action, rigorous analysis, and hard work. Maybe that's why after the Lords fell apart, so many of us in the leadership gravitated to the media, to careers in media. Pablo Guzman became a legendary street reporter at WCBS TV for more than 30 years. He just passed away last December. Felipe Luciano became an Emmy Award-winning reporter, our chairman at WNBC and Fox News. Denise Oliver became a program manager of a Black-owned radio station in Washington, D.C., and later director of the Black Film Institute. Edith Morales became an entertainment lawyer, was a counsel for PBS's Sesame Street. Geraldo Rivera, our first lawyer, he wasn't in the Lord, but he represented us, became a reporter for ABC and Fox News, and myself as a journalist first with the Philadelphia Daily News and later the New York Daily News, and of course as co-host of Democracy Now! Here in Philadelphia, the Lord's chapter was launched by youngsters like Juan Ramos, Wilfredo Rojas, Irma Lopez, who joined with those of us in New York, Chicago, and other cities to bring attention to the community's plight. By 1973, though, we had shifted our focus from organizing in the Puerto Rican community to organizing Puerto Ricans in the workplace, primarily in factories. We'd even changed our name from the Young Lords to the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization. So 2 days after I arrived here in May of 1973, I applied for and landed a job at a large garment factory on 2nd and Allegheny, L.W. Foster Sportswear, a maker of men's suits. Other lords got jobs at places like Joseph Cohen and Sons on Lehigh Avenue and other plants all around the city. My factory had 500 workers on 5 floors, about 70% of them Puerto Rican and Latino. When I started working in the steam pressing department, I discovered I was one of only 2 Latinos in the entire factory who spoke a modicum of decent English. 2 of the most feared foremen in the plant were former Nazis. The federal government was trying to deport and stand trial in Lithuania for war crimes, but they were the ones that were supervising us, right? Over time, I was able to build a core of rebellious co-workers who challenged both the company and the union leadership over the mistreatment at the plant, and we helped organize and support the national boycott against Farrah pants back then of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and led picket lines at the big national strike of the Amalgamated in 1974. The dominant Puerto Rican organization at the time in Philadelphia was the Concilio de Organizaciones Hispanas, El Concilio, led by Candelario Lamboy, reputedly the city's richest Puerto Rican. But it was an organization that was completely beholden to the then mayor, Frank Rizzo, receiving lucrative city contracts in return for political support. Rizzo, of course, led his police in terrorizing and abusing countless Black and Latino youth, as later documented by a 1980 Justice Department investigation. The year I arrived in the city, Julio Osorio, a disabled Penn Treaty junior high school student, was thrown in the Delaware River and drowned by some white youths. Around the same time, 5 Puerto Ricans were arrested in a sensational rape and murder of a young white girl and her boyfriend near the Art Museum. A citywide hysteria ensued, hearkening to the infamous Scottsboro case and a forerunner of the more recent New York Central Park 5 case that would later come. All the young men were convicted and received life sentences. One of them, Paul Valderrama, spent 5 years in prison before his lawyers and supporters, organized by Juan Ramos, were able to prove that Paul had been in Puerto Rico when the crime occurred, and they got his conviction overturned. Another of the 5, Miguel Rivera, spent 14 years in prison until an investigation by the Philadelphia Inquirer managed to get his conviction overturned, and then he was acquitted in a second trial. In the late 1970s, 6 people died when the Santiago family home was firebombed in Feltonville by whites who did not want Puerto Ricans in their neighborhoods. The 1977 fatal police shooting of of Jose Reyes followed. Once again, the community, led by former young Lord Juan Ramos, Wilfredo Rojas, and others, campaigned for justice and eventually won a civil suit against the city. After the Lords fell apart, many of us moved on to other movements and causes, but we always held fast to the slogan, unite the many to defeat the few. By the mid-1970s, I was working with the African Liberation Support Committee in Philadelphia, helping to raise financial and political support for the liberation movements in Africa against white minority rule in Rhodesia, South Africa, and Mozambique. Then came 1978, and the turning point in the modern Puerto Rican community. That year, Rizzo, in his second term as mayor, engineered a referendum to remove term limits so he could remain as mayor for life. In an effort to build the widest possible movement against this power grab, I took a job as a co-coordinator of something called the Stop Rizzo Coalition. And within that broader group, spearheaded with Juan Ramos, Wilfredo Rojas, Angel Ortiz, legal services attorney who's here, who had moved to New York, and we called ourselves Puerto Ricans United Against Rizzo. And I think we marched in the Puerto Rican Day Parade as Puerto Ricans United Against Rizzo right around this time in 1978. In the Stop Rizzo Coalition, which was the broader one, I worked closely not only with liberal Democrats, Paul Tully, a Kennedy Democrat who would later become the chief strategist of Bill Clinton's presidential victory, was my co-coordinator on the Stop Rizzo Coalition. But we also worked with Republicans who were opposed to Rizzo, with several ex-members of the Black Panther Party, like Reggie Shell and the Black United Front, and housing activists John and Milton Street, and the legendary DJ and true civil rights leader, George E. Woods, the guy with the goods, right? And whose program was the place for the Black community to get information about progressive politics. And all of us together managed in a few short weeks to register more than 100,000 new voters in the Black and Latino communities and engineer a massive turnout that overwhelmingly defeated Rizzo's referendum ploy and paved the way for Black political power in Philadelphia government. One of that early movement's most inspiring moments was a militant march organized by the Street Brothers into the heart of Rizzo territory, South Philadelphia's Whitman Park, where a coalition of right-wing whites had prevented the building of a federal public housing project for 25 years. They had held it up. More than 2,000 of us marched from North Philadelphia straight through downtown into the middle of South Philadelphia to Whitman Park, even as hundreds of angry residents tossed bottles and eggs and shouted racist obscenities at us. More than any single event, the Whitman Park March became a symbol that the era of legally sanctioned racism in Philadelphia was over. Milton Street eventually became a state senator. Of course, John Street will go on to be the president of city council and a two-term mayor of that city. After the Stop Rizzo campaign, I ended up being hired as a young reporter at the Philadelphia Daily News in November of 1978. At the time, I was the only Latino journalist with a full-time job in the city's mainstream media, including all the radio and television stations and 4 daily newspapers. Yes, there were 4 back then: the Bulletin, the Inquirer, the Daily News, and the Journal. Right? And my participation in these protests did not go well with my editors. I remember Donnie Haskins, who was my city editor, later on became a big, I think, foundation guy here in Philadelphia. One time, I think it was after the Whitman Park March, one of the reporters saw me at a march, because I used to work 3 to 11, the 3 to 11 shift, and the march had been in the morning. So by the time I get into the office at 3 o'clock, Donnie Haskins says, "Oh no, I can't have that. I can't have my reporters participating in protests and then coming and writing stories. You got to stop that." So there were many times when I had problems in the newsroom. My editor-in-chief, Gil Spencer at the time, would tell me, "You cannot be participating in these kinds of controversial activities." And I said to him, "Well, Gil, let me get this straight. The Pope just visited Philadelphia. And we all covered the Pope's visit to Philadelphia. Who was the lead writer for all of our stories on the Pope? A guy by the name of Tom Cooney. I said, Gil, do you know that Tom Cooney is the president of the Holy Name Society of his church? He is an active member of the Catholic leadership, and he's the one writing the stories about the Pope's visit, and you have no problems with him doing his activities between work hours, but you have problems with my participating in similar activities in my community. So we had battles over these things. By the early 1980s, a handful of Puerto Ricans landed jobs as producers and on-air reporters. They began producing reports for local TV, as I did in the newspaper, on the resistance by the Fishermen's Association of Vieques to the US Navy bombing of their island. This is one of the stories I wrote. Oops, sorry, went back too far. This is one of the stories I wrote back in with Lynn Washington, who's here. We had a team, 2 African-American reporters and 1 Latino. We wrote a series. This is 1980, I think, 79, on gentrification. We called it recycling then, on gentrification, the Spring Garden and Northern Liberties areas, long before people were talking about gentrification. And but we were able to get these stories into the paper because we came from communities that had different perspectives and different views on these issues. And these stories created a lot of tension in the newsroom because a lot of the reporters were living in these gentrified communities, and they didn't like being exposed suddenly to what they were unconsciously, the social change that they were unconsciously being a part of. Those of us in the Latino community who took part in the Whitman Park March soon formed the Puerto Rican Alliance, a broad umbrella group of grassroots organizations. And I remember, I'll never forget, this is where I really got to admire John Street. I knew eventually he would become mayor, although of course when he became mayor, some of his policies were highly suspect. But as he was coming up, one time John attended, he was a councilman then, and he attended the convention of the Puerto Rican Alliance at Edison High School. It was like, I forget, 400 or 500 people. And we conducted most of the sessions in Spanish. John not only spoke, he then went to the back of the auditorium and sat for the entire day. I remember at one point I went over to him, I said, John, do you want us to get you somebody to translate for you so you understand what's going on? He said, no, Juan, I want to sit here so I can understand what your people go through when they come to our meetings and nobody understands what's being said. So I just want to get the feel of not knowing what's being talked about. And so like the Street Brothers were doing in the Black community, the Alliance began to organize homeless Puerto Rican families in Philadelphia to take over or squat in abandoned homes owned by the federal government, of which there were thousands in the city at the time. We soon had more than 150 squatter families. We held, and I told this to Justina, she didn't believe it. I told her, I think we're probably the only organization that ever occupied Independence Hall, right? We were having a protest in front of the HUD regional office, which is right across the street from Independence Hall one day, trying to get the HUD officials to let our families get titles to their properties. And of course, HUD had called all these police and they were blocking the entrance to the federal building. So we were marching around and I said to Juan, Juan, Independence Hall's across the street. Now, it has nothing to do with HUD, but it is a federal building, and it's a high profile place and there's only one park ranger standing outside the door and all the tourists inside. So why don't we just sit in there? And so we did. We took all the families and the children and we marched into Independence Hall and we sat in and they didn't know what to do. First, they spent several hours figuring out whose jurisdiction it was. Was it the federal park rangers or was it the Philadelphia police? Who was going to act, right? And we were just talking about Altagracia Oppenheimer. Altagracia Oppenheimer was crazy. She drove those folks nuts. So basically, eventually, George Fensel came in, the head of the local Red Squad here, and with his detectives, and he wanted to diffuse the situation as much as possible. So we were all carried out put on buses by the police, driven about 5 or 6 blocks away, and let go. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged, because they were so embarrassed that Independence Hall, the seat of the founding of the country, had been taken over by a bunch of poor Puerto Ricans. Then several weeks later, we had a second sit-in that was even more dramatic. This was in April or so of 1980. Jimmy Carter was the president. Ted Kennedy was running a major dissident campaign to unseat Carter, right? And it was neck and neck between the two as to who would win the Democratic nomination. The Pennsylvania primary came about. And back in those days, of course, there was no cell phones and, and all this internet, when you organized a political campaign, you had index cards, you had huge phone banks in your campaign headquarters, and you called people to get them out to vote. So we discussed it, and we decided we were going to take over Jimmy Carter's campaign headquarters the night before the Pennsylvania primary, right? So, I'm sorry, the morning before the Pennsylvania primary. So once again, we got all the squatters and their kids and everyone else, and we busted into Jimmy Carter's headquarters, and we took over his headquarters. And the Carter people quickly realized that they had a problem because there was an election the next day. All of their phone banks, all of their records were in that Pennsylvania campaign headquarters. And if they didn't get us out, they would either have to arrest everybody and then have the headlines in all the papers the next day, how the Carter administration arrested all of these squatters, or they'd have to do something. And so they did something. They sent a guy by the name of Franklin Delano Lopez, who was the highest ranking Latino in the White House, to get on an Amtrak train to come down to Philadelphia to negotiate with us. Then they sent Bill Gray, the great congressman and the dean of the congressional delegation of Philadelphia, to come and negotiate with us. And Angel reminds me that it was late at night, at midnight, when he, Juan Ramos, myself, and Bill Gray sat in some little restaurant 2 blocks away. What was the name of it? Tequila, yeah. With the occupation. And Bill Gray said to us, listen, I've been authorized by the White House to tell you, you got to get out. We're not going to announce anything, but I give you my word that if you leave peacefully before sunrise, all of your squatters will get titles to their homes. And we trusted Bill Gray. We accepted his promise. Everyone came out. Carter won the primary. The Pennsylvania primary the next day and beat back Ted Kennedy. I don't know if that's, I think that's good or bad, but it happened. Obviously, he got then whomped by Reagan in November. But we were, I think the alliance's 2 activities, the Independence Hall protest and the Carter headquarters takeover, were some of the most impactful in terms of a community establishing its right to be heard and to be listened to and have its needs addressed. A big mistake we made in the Young Lords was not participating in elections. We considered them useless exercises in a country that had a 2-party duopoly. The Puerto Rican Alliance, however, transformed our view. The Alliance went on to become the group that sparked a whole new civil rights organization, the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights. And voter registration and education became a key new component of our struggle. We supported voting rights lawsuits in places like Chicago and New York that forced the creation of new Latino districts. In Chicago, the grassroots works of Chacha Jimenez of the Chicago Lords, of Rudy Lozano, Lindo Coronado, Chuy Garcia, and later Luis Gutierrez, built a formidable alliance with Harold Washington that gave birth to independent politics in Chicago. Likewise, we began building chapters of the National Congress in a half dozen towns across Pennsylvania, including Reading, Allentown, Lancaster, Kennett Square, Lebanon, as well as across the river, where CATA, el Comité en Apoyo de Trabajadores Agrícolas, was organizing farm workers in Vineland and Glassboro. And we played a huge role as well in political empowerment battles in Trenton, Jersey City, Hoboken, and Newark. In 1982, while still working at the Daily News, I, along with the brothers Efrain and David Roche, launched a bilingual newspaper in Kensington, Community Focus, as a counterpoint to the more conservative newspaper that Lamboy and the Concilio had, La Actualidad. Community Focus quickly became a virtual chronicle of the grassroots fights for equal treatment in the Puerto Rican community and a public square for a variety of opinions about that community and how it should move forward. In 1987, as I mentioned earlier, I returned to New York City. John Street, who by then was the president of the city council, and I'd been covering City Hall for the Daily News, issued one of those council proclamations, thanking me for my contribution before I left. In New York, I continued writing and maintaining ties with my old Philly friends. By the early 2000s, though, it was clear that conditions in Puerto Rico were deteriorating rapidly and that migration from the island to the US had reached near record levels. But this time, largely to Central Florida and other parts of the US. The island had entered the third phase of colonialism, the post-industrial neoliberal colonial phase. What's different? What was different about this phase? One, economic stagnation and the flight of industry between 1996 and 2006. So instead of industry entering Puerto Rico as it did during the second phase, now industry fled Puerto Rico to cheaper, lower wage countries. The withdrawal of all the US bases as a result of the Vieques struggle and the resistance of the Puerto Ricans, the United States not only got out of Vieques, they took all their bases. They were so ticked off about the resistance of the Puerto Rican people, little by little, they shut down virtually all the bases. And of course, the end of the Cold War, you didn't really need all those bases anyway. And most importantly, the peddling of massive bond debt by Wall Street financiers to prop the island up, given the fact that it was losing all its economic base. And that was coupled with an austerity program, the selling of public assets aimed at dismantling pro-labor social democratic policies, the selling of the telephone company, which had been government-owned, the selling of the water authority. They basically tried to sell off all of the public utilities in this neoliberal phase, which of course led eventually to the whole house of cards collapsing in the debt crisis of 2015. And that's a sort of story of that. What ended up happening there, of course, is the imposition of the Oversight Board, the Promesa Board, which is a return to the old classic colony, right? No longer will Puerto Ricans run their own country, even in a semblance of running it. Now you have, again, a US appointed board running the economic life of the island. Looking back at this amazing history, what I am proudest of is that a generation of activists of the 1970s and 80s of the work we accomplished, the wonderful friendships that blossomed among us, the spirit of struggle we ignited. In fact, one of the members of the National Congress who lived in Kennett Square at the time and who spearheaded defense and organizing of Puerto Rican mushroom workers was a young lawyer named Juan Sanchez. Today, I believe, the same Juan Sanchez is the chief judge of the Eastern District of Pennsylvania federal courts. Many of the activists from that time went on to their own illustrious careers. Judge Nelson Diaz, of course, who was always supportive of being with us, Angel Ortiz, who's here, Harry Marach, who ended up becoming a commissioner of human services for Pennsylvania, Juan Ramos, who went on to be a city councilman, Benjamin Ramos, who became a state representative, Rafaela Colon, Lydia Hernandez, Mike DeBerardinis, who was one of our closest allies in Kensington, obviously became a big figure in the Kinney administration, Roger Zepanik, Ray Collazo, Altagracia Oppenheimer, Efrain and David Roche, so many more, all fighters for social justice, all of whom made enormous contributions in their time to this city, which is why I feel so lucky to have been in the trenches with them, to have shared the good times and the bad, the heated discussions and the lively parandas and festivals, to carry forward the lessons of a community that has never stopped insisting on basic respect and dignity, even in the face of colonial neglect, that has always been proud of being Puerto Rican. So I'll leave it there.